The cobblestone streets of the coastal city were always cold, regardless of the season. For Haru, the world was a collection of muted grays and hollow echoes. He stood on the same street corner every afternoon, his violin tucked beneath his chin, playing melodies that felt more like mourning ghosts than living music. Passers-by were nothing but blurred, faceless shapes moving through a life he no longer felt part of. His inspiration had withered long ago, leaving behind a silence the city no longer cared to break. He was a man lost in the mechanical noise of a world that had stopped listening to its own heart. One Tuesday, the sharp salt in the air pulled him toward the shoreline, away from the concrete cages of the downtown district. That was when he saw her. Yuki sat on a weathered wooden pier, her hair dancing in the sea breeze, her fingers stained with vibrant streaks of azure and gold. She was sketching the horizon with an intensity that made Haru stop mid-breath, his violin case forgotten in his hand. When she finally looked up and caught his gaze, she smiled, and it was as if someone had suddenly turned the lights on in a dark, forgotten room. For the first time in years, Haru felt the flicker of a melody that wasn't a funeral march. As the humid breath of summer took hold, their lives began to weave together like the intricate patterns on a silk tapestry. They spent every waking moment exploring the hidden corners of the coast. Haru would play while Yuki painted, her brushstrokes following the rise and fall of his strings. They merged their worlds for a local gallery project, an immersive experience where his music would breathe life into her canvases. In her presence, Haru's music regained its soul. He wasn't just playing for the city anymore. He was playing for the way the golden hour caught the flecks of amber in her eyes. Sitting under the skeletal branches of the winter cherry trees that lined the park, they made an unspoken promise. These trees were famous for their resilience, blooming in the harsh cold as a final defiance against the frost. Yuki whispered that they would return when the first petals fell, witnessing the rare beauty of life thriving in the dead of winter. Haru squeezed her hand, believing they had all the time in the world. He didn't notice the slight tremor in her fingers or the way she blinked repeatedly as if trying to clear a thickening fog that only she could see. But as summer waned, the vibrant colors started to bleed into long shadows. Yuki grew quieter. Sometimes, she would reach for a paintbrush and miss the handle entirely, her hand grasping at empty air. She laughed it off, blaming the heat, but her smiles were becoming brittle. Haru noticed she walked with caution, her steps heavy and uncertain. He wanted to ask, to scream his concerns, but she always redirected him back to the music, back to the fragile beauty of the present moment. The truth shattered Haru's world on a rainy afternoon. He had gone to her bag to find an eraser, and instead found a heavy plastic bottle filled with pills he couldn't pronounce. Tucked behind the medicine was a medical file, worn at the edges. As his eyes scanned the pages, the words terminal and degenerative leapt out like jagged shards of glass. She hadn't been hiding a temporary illness. She had been carrying a death sentence since long before their paths crossed. Every laugh they shared was a stolen moment from a clock that was rapidly ticking down. The realization hit him like a physical blow, but before he could process the grief, the world chose for them. They were at the gallery for their final rehearsal when he heard the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. Yuki lay collapsed amidst her paintings, her eyes fluttering, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. At the hospital, the sterile lights felt like a violent intrusion. The vibrant artist was now a fragile ghost beneath bleached sheets. Haru stood by the window, the sound of the ocean outside mocking him with its eternal rhythm. The doctor entered with a heavy silence. He didn't speak of recovery, but only of comfort and the little time that remained. The disease had accelerated beyond control. The woman who had brought color back to Haru's life was fading. Her time was no longer measured in months, but in the fleeting span of days. The hospital room was a world of white that seemed to bleed into everything. Haru sat in a rigid, lonely chair, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor becoming the only pulse he recognized. The air was heavy with bitter antiseptic and the quiet desperation of those who had run out of time. He watched Yuki's chest rise and fall, a fragile motion like a bird struggling against a cage. The doctors were clear. The disease had reached the center of her being, and the clock was no longer ticking in seasons, but in the slow, agonizing drip of an IV bag. Inside, Haru was a storm of glass. Every part of him wanted to rail against a universe that would give him back his soul only to snatch its source away. Yet whenever Yuki's eyes flickered open, he forced a smile. Becoming a pillar of strength made of crumbling sand, he told her stories of the city, of the people who missed her art, and of the music he was writing. He became a guardian of the light, refusing to let the shadows seep into her room. It was a performance more difficult than any he had ever given, a symphony of lies meant to protect the vibrant artist who already knew the truth. However, the mask cracked when Yuki regained her strength enough to speak. Her voice was a thin thread, yet it carried a weight that nearly broke him. She looked at the tubes connecting her to the wall, and then at Haru, her eyes clouded but searching. She told him to leave, her words sharp with a mercy that felt like a blade. She didn't want him to remember her like this, a fading sketch of the girl who had painted the sunset. She begged him to go back to the streets, to play his violin where the world was alive. She wanted her death to be a quiet exit, not a weight that would anchor him forever. But Haru wouldn't budge. He realized silence was the enemy. The next day, he returned not with flowers, but with his violin case. He transformed the sterile ward into a sanctuary of sound. The first note was tentative, but as he played, the room seemed to expand. The white walls dissolved into memories of the pier, and the clinical hospital smell was replaced by the phantom scent of salt. He didn't just play for her, he played through her, weaving her spirit into every crescendo. This emotional breakthrough shattered her defenses. She stopped pushing him away and reached for his hand, her fingers finding strength in the vibration of the music. This piece was shattered by Yuki's family. They brought a cold gust of reality and bitterness born of grief. Her parents, estranged during her summer of freedom, looked at Haru with suspicion. To them, he was a stranger who encouraged her delusions of art when she should have been under rigid care. They saw his music as a distraction, a false hope that lured her away from traditional treatments. The tension was suffocating as they argued over her care in the hallway. Amidst the shouting, Yuki's gaze remained fixed on the window. During a quiet moment, she whispered her final wish. She didn't want to die where the windows didn't open. She wanted to feel the spray of the tide one last time. It was a request for a final escape, but Haru knew it was the only way to honor her. He began to plan the impossible. He watched the guard shifts and waited for the night. He prepared a wheelchair and a warm coat, his heart hammering. He leaned over Yuki, whispering that it was time to see the sea. She smiled, a genuine spark returning to her eyes. But just as he reached to disconnect the sensors, a piercing wail erupted from the equipment. The steady pulse on the monitor collapsed into a flat line, and the room was flooded with the frantic red glow of an alarm. The alarm screamed, a jagged sound that tore through the sterile silence. Nurses scrambled in the hallway, their footsteps a frantic percussion. Haru didn't freeze. He knew this was the threshold. With a strength born of desperation, he checked the monitors one last time. It was a warning, a glitch in the machine's perception of a failing spirit. Ignoring the red lights, he lifted Yuki's frail form into the wheelchair hidden behind the curtains. They slipped through the service exit, the cold night air hitting them like a baptism. The world outside was indifferent to their tragedy, the stars blinking with a cold, distant clarity. They reached the shore as the moon hung low, painting the waves in silver. The sound of the Pacific was a rhythmic breathing that matched Yuki's shallow gasps. Haru settled her onto a weathered wooden bench overlooking the expanse of black water. He wrapped his coat around her, but her skin was already turning to marble. She didn't speak. Her eyes, though clouded, were fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea. Haru reached for his violin. This was the moment he had been writing toward since the day they met among the winter cherries. He began to play. The music wasn't a lament, it was a defiant celebration. It started with a low vibrato that mimicked the tide, then rose into a soaring melody that captured the vibrant yellows of Yuki's paintings. He played through his exhaustion, through the searing ache in his chest, and through the salt spray that blurred his vision. Every stroke of the bow was a word he couldn't say, a promise he was finally keeping. Yuki's hand moved slightly, her fingers twitching in time with the tempo, a ghost of the artist sketching her final masterpiece. In that shared space of sound and sea, they acknowledged that the pain of separation was a small price for the brilliance they had found. As the first light of dawn touched the world, Yuki's breathing slowed. The struggle for air smoothed into a long, quiet sigh. Her head leaned against Haru's shoulder, her weight becoming a permanent part of him even as her spirit drifted away. The sun began its ascent, turning the water into a mirror of molten gold, signaling a new day she would never inhabit. Haru didn't stop playing until the last echo of the final note was swallowed by the surf. He held her until the warmth left her skin, watching the world wake up while his own world had quietly ceased to spin. The weeks that followed were a blur of gray. Haru returned to the city, but the streets felt like a hollow theater. He couldn't play his violin. The silence Yuki left behind was a physical barrier that blocked every note. He wandered the paths where she used to sketch, looking for a sign that she hadn't vanished. It was only when he summoned the courage to open her last sketchbook that he found his way back. Hidden in a secret compartment was a letter and a final painting. The painting depicted the two of them standing under a canopy of winter cherry blossoms. They were both healthy, smiling, bathed in a light beyond time and sickness. The letter was short, written in a shaky hand. She told him that he was her greatest masterpiece and that his music had made her feel immortal. She begged him not to let the music die, but to use it as a bridge for others lost in the dark. That discovery ignited a transformation. Haru didn't just return to the streets, he took their story to the world. He became a composer of legendary status. His symphonies played in the great halls of every continent. Each composition was a chapter of their summer, a movement dedicated to the girl who saw color where others saw shadow. He lived as a vessel for her legacy, proving that while fate tore them apart, their love remained an immortal melody.